Welcome back to GMT with me, David Eads. Now, the Trump administration has outlined plans to end the right of people who've entered the country illegally over the border with Mexico to then apply for asylum. An official statement from the Department of Homeland Security suggests that President Trump does have the authority to restrict illegal immigration if it's in the national interest. So he's understood to be preparing to sign that measure into law. Can he do it? Well, let's speak now to Dr. Ruvi Ziegler, who's the Associate Professor of International Refugee Law at Reading University here in England, although currently in Bangkok. Ruvi Ziegler, thanks very much for joining us. There is clearly an issue as to whether Mr. Trump is allowed to do this by national law, but what about the international perspective? Can you do this sort of thing?
Well, I mean, so the United States has signed up to the 1967 New York Protocol, signed up as far back as 1968, and actually incorporated into U.S. law in the Refugee Act of 1980, and that protocol effectively extended the Refugee Convention so that it applies to refugees coming from any place in the world to any countries that have signed that convention. And ultimately, a refugee is somebody who meets the definition of a refugee under that convention, somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution for a convention reason. And so in order to assess whether somebody meets that definition or not, if that person arrives at the United States, whether they arrive irregularly, illegally, or otherwise, the United States is required under international law to then assess their individual application. It cannot, as a matter of general application, suggest that if they have arrived illegally, they will be automatically rejected.
Yeah, OK, but many people probably would say, well, there's a certain sense to this, isn't there? If there are lots of people coming across the border in whatever way and from whatever direction they wish, and they're not monitored at the point of crossing, who's to say when they actually come forward and say, actually, I'm now seeking asylum? So presumably this is the point of it, isn't it, to just cut that traffic?
Well, I mean, the reality is that the United States can police its border. It does know precisely at what point. I mean, you can trace that quote-unquote caravan going through Mexico. So some of its members have applied for asylum in Mexico. About 1,500 of them have done so already. And you could, as soon as people cross into the United States, you could try to seek and see whether they have an asylum claim or not. This is something countries have done in the past, including the United States. The idea that individuals cross irregularly into a country and then seek asylum is perhaps very unfortunately actually the more common way in which people get asylum.
Which is understandable. I understand that. Presumably some other countries have done either precisely what Mr. Trump's trying to do or something very similar.
Right. So, I mean, countries the world over try to disincentivize people from arriving irregularly. Right. This is not unique to the U.S. The idea that there will be some sort of a blanket ban on applying for asylum has a recent precedent to some extent by an act passed by the Hungarian parliament back in June this year. That applies to people who have gotten to Hungary via countries that are not considered to be persecutory. So this is now under challenge under EU law, because Hungary is, of course, a member of the EU. Australia had policies of trying to create a disadvantage for people who arrive by boats by trying to have them processed offshore in Nauru and in Papua New Guinea. I think what's interesting about the U.S. move that even that very stark statement by the acting Attorney General and the Homeland Security Secretary still insists that even they will still not be sending people back to places where they might face torture or risk to their life or freedom. So even they recognize that there are certain principles that they cannot flout.
And they'll stick to that. OK, Ruvi, sorry to interrupt you. I'm going to have to bring it to a halt there, but thank you very much indeed for your analysis and your guidance on obviously a politically highly sensitive issue there. Ruvi Ziegler joining us from Bangkok, in fact.